Hey, welcome to Gold Scratch and welcome back. This is the second video in a series of engine repair. So typically our videos about building up an engine from scratch or upgrading an engine. So this engine I already introduced on a previous video. My customer Paul Vanderspeck brought it to me, so someone else built it somewhere in the past. I talked about it. Had the 292 1970 292 angle plug heads. I did mention in the previous video, these heads never came on a car. They were over the counter. You could buy them from GM back then. And I remember in the early 70s, man, if you had angle plug heads, you were pretty cool. The early 70s, you didn't have Promax and AFR and all these guys around, by the way. Back then, you pretty much worked with GM stuff. So this was pretty much the ultimate. The 292 head, which they came on the 70 350 horse 350s and Z28s and Corvettes, I think. So anyway, back to the engine. So what I had done already, we made a decision to take it apart based on leak down, and we had 40% leak down in one cylinder, 28 in another. I showed the numbers in the previous video. And that told me that we had to keep going as far as taking it apart. Now, I think I mentioned before, this is a repair and we're trying to minimize the cost of the repair and not do anything that's not necessary to do. It was a pretty nice engine, but Paul told me that it just developed a knock, not a real serious one, but enough to have him concerned enough to take the engine out, right? So based on that, I took it apart as far as you can see right now. The pistons are all organized there. There's my heads. There's the block. The crankshaft is still in it, but I've taken the mains out. All the rocker arms and lifters and push rods are organized in my organizer. So some good news, the camshaft's in perfect condition. You can tell that by looking at the bottom of the lifter. I haven't measured the camshaft lift. Paul thinks it's something around 480 thousandths, but every lifter looks like it's brand new. And these are these nice, you can't see it from there probably, but these nice lifters with a little groove in the bottom. And so breaking in the camshaft, trepidation is not going to be an issue when we put it back together. So, but we didn't want to do any more or less than necessary to make sure we did what we have to do. It's kind of a surgical repair, if I can call it that. So, just to cover off, first of all, we knew that the knocking sound didn't come from anything to do with leak down, or not likely anyway, unless it was a collapsed piston or piston slapping hard on the cylinder wall or something. But we had to take it apart anyway, and it's a good thing we did. So to address, first of all, the leak down, the only thing that I found was the cylinders, all the cylinders looked the same. Normal wear, there's no ridge or anything like that. It's a standard bore engine. It can easily be hand honed. I'll hone it with a 220 and then a 400 grit. We use chrome moly rings. There's some chrome in them. And putting them back together. And so we'll put a new hone in it. I did mention in the previous video, I might even reuse the rings. Well, based on that leak down number, it probably won't. But what I did find was in the two cylinders that had high leak down numbers, the top compression rings were lined up perfectly. And that doesn't help, that's for sure. I'm actually a little surprised if that's the only cause of having a 40% leak down versus 5 or 10%, which we had in the good cylinders. But that's what I found. Nothing else. The pistons have normal wear. They're all dirty. They'll get cleaned up. They are flat top piston with one slot valve relief. So this engine, by the way, probably went pretty good. I would guess that's probably about 375 horsepower. So 350. But with the flat top pistons, 64 cc heads, I don't know. I'll measure the combustion chamber volume, whether they were cut or not. But even if they were, it'll be around 10.5 to 1 compression ratio. So it'll be a pretty nice performing engine. So what went wrong? So here's the evidence on the connecting rods, everyone looks like this. I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but you can see the copper, and this is the main bearing obviously, but the connecting rod bearings look exactly the same. The copper is showing, show you the main bearing cap. But something else I want to show you in the rods. So every connecting rod in the top half is worn down to the copper. Sorry. And one other thing, when you set the bearing insert into the rod, there's no crush. The bearing insert can float back and forth like that. And that's not a good thing. Typically, with the bearing is good and the rod is not distorted, when you set the bearing insert in, it'll crush into place. When you bolt the cap on, there's actually a little bit of interference that crushes the bearing into the rod, and that keeps it from turning. The little groove here is, and believe it whatever you want, it's okay, but the little groove is really to keep the bearing from moving laterally. If you're installing a piston, by the way, just while we're holding on to it, so there's a chamfer on one side of the rod that goes against the side of the crankshaft. So on 1, 3, and 5, and 7, it's at the front. And if you had on 2, 4, 6, and 8, that chamfer goes at the back of the crankshaft. The flat goes against the other connecting rod. Okay, so just something to point out when we're doing that. So that leaves me to be concerned about the connecting rods, whether there's some distortion. This engine's probably been pounded on pretty good, and that's okay. That's what we build them for, right? So, but the fact that we have copper showing in every bearing. The other thing, when you look at the crankshaft, and the mains and rods are about the same. We'll do all the measuring, but I don't want to spend any more time or costs on Paul until we know what Paul wants to do, and therefore we can minimize the total cost. But if you take and rub your fingernail across the crankshaft, and you can feel the grooves in the crankshaft catching your fingernail, you don't need to measure anything. All you have to do is decide that you got to turn the crank, you got to turn the mains, you got to turn the rods, and refinish the crankshaft. So both rods and mains, they're standard right now, fortunately. Both rods and mains are going to have to get turned. So here's another consideration. If we decide to recondition the rods, you got R&R, the pistons got to come off. These pistons are pressed on, these rods are pressed on. So I mentioned machine shops before. Machine shops provide a reliable service, but the work is expensive and it takes time and costs money. So by the time I pay a machine shop to R&R the pistons, recondition the rods, install new rod bolts, refinish them, ready to go, it's not much difference to buy a brand new set of rods. And what's happened is, over time, the cost of machining is going up, and believe it or not, the cost of things like connecting rods and aftermarket crankshafts are coming down. At one time, I mentioned already, back in the day, we worked with OEM stuff because that's all we had. We didn't have all these guys marketing Eagle and Scat and all these companies marketing stuff. We worked with OEM stuff. But now you can buy a nice Eagle connecting rod, great for street. It's got ARP rod bolts in it. For about, by the time I get done with all the things I have to do, not much different. And so let's talk about the crankshaft. The crankshaft is kind of the same thing. We take this crankshaft to a machine shop. About a third of the crankshafts I take to a machine shop, I get a call a couple of days later, hey Al, your crankshaft's got a crack in it. Now, if you didn't know about that crack, you probably could drive it another 100,000 miles and you never know the difference. But once you know about it, you got to deal with it, right? So that's one of the issues. And then it has to be Magnaflux, of course, and that costs money. Has to be jet washed and clean, ground and polished. And by the time they get done with all that nowadays, you can probably buy a brand new crankshaft for about the same price. Pretty darn close at least. So that'll be the options I'll be giving Paul when I get a chance to talk to him. And I'll give him a quote, what it's going to cost to repair this. But essentially what we're proposing, probably a new crankshaft, new rods. I'll buy the rods full floating so I can install them myself. I don't have to take them to a machine shop. And I'll hand hone this, I'll clean this block. I've already power washed it once, but once it's totally assembled, all the oil plugs come out, the frost plugs come out, and it gets power washed again and cleaned meticulously. It was very clean on the inside, by the way. It was a little messy on the outside, but the oil pan, there was no sludge or grunge or anything there, so we'll probably clean that up ourselves. Hone the cylinder walls with 220 to start and 400 to finish, 400 grit, and we'll be using Molly rings and Molly top ring and cast second ring, just the standard ring package, 532nd rings, nothing real crazy to get Paul back on the road. So that's what we're proposing, and stick with us. We'll see what happens next. Thank you for watching Gold Scratch. Please like and subscribe.